At my son's engagement party, I gave him an envelope I'd been saving for 22 years. He laughed, handed it to his fiancée without even opening it. She peeled back the flap, looked inside, and said, "Is this a joke?" Then she dropped it on the gift table like it was a flyer from a pizza shop. Her mother picked it up, held it between two fingers, and set it back down. "How sweet," she said. "A savings bond." My son didn't correct her, didn't say anything, just put his arm around his fiancée and walked away. The next morning, I called my financial advisor. She went quiet on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," she said, "that's not my name. She always called me the wrong name." She said, "Are you absolutely sure?" I was sure, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Frances. I'm 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Sudbury, Ontario, the same house I moved into after my husband left in 1998. I worked as a home care aide for 24 years. I drove to people's homes before sunrise, helped them bathe, helped them dress, made their breakfast, sat with them when no one else came. I did this 6 days a week for almost a quarter century. The pay was never good. The hours were long. Most people, when they found out what I did for work, nodded politely and changed the subject. My son Warren grew up watching me leave before he woke up and come home after dark. He ate cereal for dinner more nights than I can count. He wore the same winter coat for 3 years because I couldn't justify buying a new one. I told him every single time he complained that this was temporary, that we were building something, that patience was the whole point. He didn't believe me. I don't think he ever did. Warren is 34 now. He met his fiancée, Claudine, 2 years ago at some kind of industry event in Toronto. She works in marketing. Her parents own a chain of dental clinics in the GTA and a cottage on Lake Simcoe. The first time I met her family, her father shook my hand and asked what I did. I told him. He said, "Oh, community care? Right, very important work," and turned to speak to Warren before I'd finished nodding. I understood immediately what I was in that room. I was the backstory Warren was slightly embarrassed by. I'd been carrying the envelope since before Warren graduated high school. It started as a small thing, a savings bond purchased in 2002 for $500, tucked into a fireproof box I kept on the top shelf of my closet. Over time, I added to it. Not always money, sometimes documents. A letter I'd written him when he was 16, and I was afraid he was pulling away from me. A photograph of his grandfather, who died before Warren was old enough to remember him. And yes, more bonds, more certificates, more small folded papers that represented night shifts and skipped vacations, and the one winter I didn't fix the kitchen tap because I needed the plumber money for something else. The envelope wasn't symbolic. It was real. By the time I handed it to him at that party, the total value of what it contained and what it pointed to was just over $412,000. Not that he asked. The party was at Claudine's parents' house in Oakville. A catered affair, servers in white shirts, little plates of things I didn't recognize. I drove down from Sudbury in my Civic, arrived exactly on time, and stood near the drinks table for the first 40 minutes because I didn't know anyone, and Warren was busy being Warren, laughing loudly, backslapping Claudine's brother, performing the version of himself he built for this life he was living now. I waited until I saw him alone near the back door. I walked over and held out the envelope. "I've been keeping this for you," I said, "for a long time." He took it, looked at it, called Claudine over. She came with her mother, Diane, trailing behind. Diane was wearing a silk blouse and had the particular energy of a woman who has never waited for anything in her life. Warren opened the envelope. He looked at the savings bond on top, the old paper kind, the kind banks don't really issue anymore. He flipped it over. "Read the denomination." His expression didn't change the way I'd hoped. It went the other way. "Mom." His voice dropped. "You didn't have to." Claudine took the bond from him, glanced at it, handed it to her mother. Diane held it for a moment, then set it on the gift table with careful indifference. "A savings bond," she said, and her tone did the rest of the work her words didn't need to do. Claudine looked at Warren. "Is this the main gift?" I started to speak. I wanted to explain about the account connected to it, the investments that had compounded over 2 decades, the documents at the bottom of the envelope. But Warren spoke first. "It's from a while ago," he said. "Mom likes to keep things old school." He smiled at Claudine, small, apologetic. The smile of a man creating distance. I stopped talking. He took the envelope from Diane's hands and put it on the table without looking at me. Then Claudine pulled him toward a group of her colleagues, and that was it. No one looked back. I stood there in my good blouse from Reitman's and understood something clearly for the first time. My son was not embarrassed by the gift. He was embarrassed by me. I picked up the envelope from the gift table. I put it back in my purse. Then I found my coat, said goodbye to no one, and drove 4 hours back to Sudbury in the dark. I didn't cry until I got home, and then I cried the way I hadn't cried in years. The ugly, shapeless kind, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the light off. Not because he'd dismissed the gift, because I'd finally understood that all those years of sacrifice had not in fact communicated what I'd intended. He hadn't watched me work and thought, "She is building something." He'd watched me work and thought, "This is just how things are for us." The next morning, I called Gail. Gail Pemberton has been my financial advisor for 16 years. She's the one who convinced me, in 2009, to stop putting everything into bonds and start diversifying. She's the reason the number in my accounts is what it is. She's also the only person besides me who knows exactly how much I have. I told her what happened at the party. She was quiet for a long time. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to restructure," I said. "Everything, starting with the Oakville property." Another silence. "Frances, you own the Oakville property through the numbered company. Warren doesn't know that." "I know." "Does he know you own anything in Oakville?" "He doesn't know I own anything, period." I heard her breathe. "All right," she said. "Come in on Thursday. We'll go through it." I should explain the Oakville property. In 2011, a small commercial plaza in Oakville came up for sale. It had been mismanaged for years. Half the units empty, the parking lot in disrepair, a dry cleaner and a lottery retailer as the only tenants. My brother-in-law, who was in construction, walked through it with me and said it was a money pit. My accountant at the time said the same thing. I bought it anyway through a numbered company I registered in Ontario because I'd been reading about commercial real estate for 3 years, and I could see what the mismanagement had hidden. Good bones, a corner lot, proximity to a transit corridor that the city had just announced plans to expand. I fixed the parking lot. I found a physiotherapy clinic that needed space. A dental office followed, then a tutoring center. By 2017, the plaza was fully tenanted and generating consistent income. I refinanced and bought a 4-plex in Barrie, then a triplex in North Bay. By the time Warren was planning his engagement party, I owned 7 properties across Ontario, all held in numbered companies, all generating income that I was quietly reinvesting. I lived in Sudbury in my 2-bedroom house. I drove my Civic. I kept working as a home care aide because the work mattered to me and because I was not ready to explain to anyone, least of all my son, how I had spent my evenings and weekends for the past 20 years. What I had not accounted for was that Warren had become the kind of person who would hand his mother's gift to his fiancée without opening it. After my meeting with Gail, I made 3 calls. The first was to my property manager, Hugh, who handled the Oakville Plaza. I told him I was considering converting 2 of the commercial units to a different use and that I wanted to pause lease renewals until I'd made a decision. He asked if something had changed. I said, yes, the situation had changed. The second call was to a lawyer named Deborah Asante, who had handled 2 of my property acquisitions and who I trusted completely. I told her I wanted to update my estate documents and restructure the beneficial ownership of my numbered companies. She asked if I was doing this for tax reasons. I said, partly. The third call I sat with for a long time before making, it was to my son. He answered on the 4th ring. I could hear background noise, a restaurant or a bar. Mom, hey, everything okay? Everything's fine, I said. I just wanted to say I was sorry I left early. The drive back got long, and I didn't want to say goodbye in the middle of things. Oh, a pause. Yeah, it was a good party. Claudine's family really put it together. They did, I agreed. She seems happy. She is. He sounded relaxed, relieved I wasn't upset. Listen, about the envelope. Claudine thought it was a sweet gesture. She really did. I'm glad, I said. And then I'll let you get back to your evening. I just wanted to check in. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for an hour. I wasn't angry. I was done being angry. I was in the part that comes after anger, the quiet part, where you start making decisions. 3 weeks later, I had lunch with a woman named Sheila Tron, who ran a nonprofit in Hamilton, focused on housing access for seniors. I'd been following her organization's work for a year. We'd exchanged a few emails. Over sandwiches at a place downtown, I told her I was considering redirecting a significant asset and asked if she'd be interested in talking about what that might look like. She set down her coffee very carefully. How significant? She asked. I told her. She looked at me for a moment. You're a home care worker. I was, I said. I retired last month. She picked up her coffee again. All right, she said. Let's talk. I want to be clear about something. What I was doing was not revenge. It wasn't a performance for my son's benefit or a move I was making so that he'd eventually find out and feel bad. What happened at that engagement party was a catalyst, not a cause. I had been building toward a decision for years. What to do with what I'd accumulated, who it should serve, what purpose it should have, beyond just sitting in accounts with my name on it. Warren's reaction clarified something I had been avoiding clarifying. He didn't know me. And I had allowed that. But the Oakville property, that one was harder to let go of. Not because of the money, because of what it meant. Claudine's parents' house, the one where the engagement party had been held, was 8 minutes from the plaza I owned. Every time Claudine and Warren drove to her parents for Sunday dinner, they passed a parking lot I had repaved in 2013. They had no idea. That had always been satisfying in a quiet, private way. Now I was deciding to release that satisfaction. I told Hugh to begin the conversion process on 2 of the commercial units. One would be reconfigured as affordable office space for registered nonprofits. The other would become a satellite location for a senior support organization that had been looking for space in Oakville for 2 years and couldn't afford the market rate. It took 6 weeks. It wasn't dramatic. Workers came. Walls were repositioned. Signage changed. I drove down once to walk through the space and stood in what used to be an insurance broker's office. Now, empty and clean and waiting to serve a different purpose. A woman from the seniors organization met me there. She shook my hand and said, "We've been trying to find something in this area for so long." She didn't know why I was doing this. I didn't explain. I just said I was glad the space would be used well. Warren called on a Sunday evening in October. "Mom, something weird came up." "What's that?" Claudine's dad was at this networking thing and someone mentioned a plaza in Oakville that just changed hands in terms of usage, converted some units to nonprofit space. He paused. "The numbered company that owns it." Deborah looked it up for me. The registered address is a law firm in Sudbury. "Mom, do you know anything about that?" I let the silence sit for a moment. "Why would I know about a numbered company in Oakville?" I said. "I don't know. It's probably nothing." But his voice had changed. "Mom, do you own property?" I said. "Warren, I think we should talk in person. Can you come up to Sudbury?" He arrived on a Thursday. Claudine wasn't with him. He sat at my kitchen table with a coffee and looked at me across the same surface where I'd helped him with homework 20 years ago, and I told him everything. I didn't make it dramatic. I just told him. The first savings bond in 2002. The decision to start looking at real estate in the mid-2000s. The Oakville Plaza, the Barry Fourplex, the others. The total portfolio value, as of my last statement. The fact that the envelope I'd handed him at his engagement party was connected to accounts and assets worth considerably more than a single savings bond. He didn't speak for a long time after I finished. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally said. His voice was strange. Not angry. Something else. "Because I wanted to know who you were without the money changing things." He looked down at his coffee. "And I didn't answer right away. I thought about the engagement party, the way he'd handed the envelope to Claudine, the apologetic smile, the 8 minutes between his future in-law's house and a parking lot I'd had repaved. I found out some things, I said, and then I found out some more things when you called to ask about the numbered company. He went still. What does that mean? It means that when something seems financially interesting, you make calls, which is practical. I'm not criticizing it. I wrapped both hands around my mug. But you didn't make any calls about me until there was something financial to investigate. The words landed the way I'd known they would. He didn't argue. He just sat there. The savings bond, he said eventually, at the party. I didn't. He stopped. Claudine's family, they're not. It's a different context. I know what you felt, I said. I've known what you felt since about 3 hours after I arrived at that party. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. The furnace clicked on. I'm sorry, Mom. I know. What does this mean? For everything. For the estate? It means I'm restructuring, I said. I'm directing a significant portion toward charitable purposes, specifically housing access and seniors' care. What remains will be handled the way I see fit, and some of it will eventually come to you. But I'm not in a rush, and the timeline will depend on things that have nothing to do with numbers. He looked at me. Things like what? Things like whether I know who my son is. Before he left, he stood in the front hallway and looked at the photographs on the wall. There was one from when he was 9, the two of us at Killarney Provincial Park, his face sunburned and squinting at the camera. I remember taking that trip on a budget so tight I packed every meal in a cooler. He'd complained about the sandwiches the whole weekend. He'd also at one point held my hand on a portage trail because the rocks were slippery and didn't let go until we reached the water. He looked at that photograph for a long time. I forgot about that trip, he said. I didn't, I said. He left. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out and head south. The months that followed were not a clean resolution. I want to be honest about that, because stories that tie up neatly are usually lying to you somewhere. Warren called more. At first the calls were awkward, careful, like conversations between people who have broken something valuable and aren't sure what the damage is. Claudine called once, which surprised me. She was stiff at first, and then she wasn't. And by the end she said, I think I made a wrong assumption about a lot of things, which was more than I expected. I kept restructuring. Deborah finished the estate updates. Gail and I went through every account. I made decisions that felt right and a few that I'm still not certain about. I signed the agreement with Sheila's organization in Hamilton. I drove down for the formal handover of the Oakville units in February, stood in the parking lot I'd had repaved, now with new accessible spaces I'd added the previous spring, and watched a senior couple walk through the door of the new satellite office for the first time. The woman had a rolling walker. She looked up at the sign on the door and then turned to say something to her husband, and I couldn't hear what she said. But he nodded, and they went inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes after that. In March, Warren drove up on a Saturday with no particular reason given. He showed up at 11 in the morning with a bag of bagels from a place in Barrie he knew I liked, and a slightly awkward energy that I recognized as his version of trying. We sat at the kitchen table. He told me about his work. I told him about a course I'd started online, commercial property management, the one I'd always meant to take properly and never had time for when I was still working. He seemed genuinely surprised. You're still learning, he said, and I said, why would I stop? He looked at me the way he used to when he was small, and I'd said something that shifted the shape of the world slightly for him. That evening, before he drove back, he asked if he could see the savings bond. I still had it. I'd taken the envelope back from the gift table that night in Oakville and never returned it. I went to the closet and got the fireproof box. I set the bond on the table between us, and then, under it, the letter I'd written him when he was 16. He read it slowly. I watched him read it. When he finished, he folded it carefully back along the original creases. You wrote this when I was 16, he said. You were pulling away. I didn't know what to do with that. So I wrote it down. He nodded. Didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I thought you just didn't notice. I noticed everything, I said. I always noticed everything. He drove home at dusk. I watched the taillights until they disappeared at the end of the street, and then I went back inside and made tea and sat by the window and thought about 24 years of leaving before sunrise and coming home after dark, and what it meant that a person could do all of that without the person they were doing it for ever quite seeing it. I'm not angry. I said that before and I'll say it again because it's still true. What I am is clear about what I built, about what it was for, about the difference between what we tell ourselves we're doing and what we're actually doing, and the harder difference between what we give and what other people are equipped to receive. The envelope is still in the fireproof box. The box is still on the top shelf of my closet. The letter is back inside it, refolded exactly the way Warren folded it. He didn't throw the envelope away. He didn't know what he had. That's not the same thing as not caring, even if it felt that way in a parking lot in Oakville on a Saturday night. It took me some time to understand that distinction. I think it's taking him time, too. The work was never about the money. The money was just evidence of the work. And the work, all 24 years of it, the early mornings and the long drives and the people I helped dress and fed and sat with, that work had dignity in it, not because it made me wealthy, because it was honest and I showed up for it, and somewhere in the doing of it I learned what I was made of. That's not spare change. That was never spare change. Before I close, I want to say something directly to you, whoever's listening. If you have ever been dismissed because of what you do instead of who you are, if someone has looked at your work and decided it told them everything they needed to know about your worth, I want you to know that they were wrong. The work you do does not contain the whole of you. Neither does what's in your bank account or your address or the kind of car in your driveway. Those things are just the surface. Underneath them is everything you decided every morning about what mattered and what didn't. I kept deciding. For 24 years, I kept deciding. And I'd make the same choices again, every single one. I've been thinking lately about what we owe the people we love and what we don't. For a long time, I believed that sacrifice spoke for itself. That if you showed up consistently enough, worked hard enough, went without enough, the people closest to you would eventually understand what that meant, what it cost, what it was for. I think a lot of parents believe this, especially parents who came up without much, who learned early that you keep your head down and you build quietly and you don't make noise about what it takes. You just do it. And somewhere underneath all that doing, there's this hope, not even fully spoken to yourself, that one day the person you did it all for will look at you and see it clearly. What I learned the hard way is that hope is not a plan. Warren didn't see me clearly because I had never shown him clearly. I'd hidden the evidence of what I was building, and I told myself it was a test, a way of finding out who he really was. But tests are only honest when both people know they're being tested. What I was actually doing was protecting myself from a conversation I was afraid to have, and the cost of that avoidance was 22 years of my son not knowing who his mother was. When he dropped that envelope on the table, when Claudine held it by the corner like it was something she wasn't sure about, the hurt I felt was real. I don't want to minimize it, but if I'm being honest with myself, which I try to be these days, some of what I felt was the particular sting of a consequence I had set in motion myself. I had kept Warren at a distance from the truth of my life, and so he lived at that distance. That's not entirely his failure. The choices I made afterward, the restructuring, the Oakville units, the work with Sheila's organization, those weren't punishments. I want to be clear about that. They were decisions I'd been moving toward for years and hadn't had the courage to commit to. What happened at that engagement party gave me the clarity I'd been putting off. Sometimes it takes something that hurts to make you stop postponing what you already know is right. What I keep coming back to is this. Character isn't revealed in the big moments. It's built in the small ones. Every morning, I got up before Warren was awake and drove to someone else's home and helped them through the hardest part of their day. That was a choice about what kind of person I wanted to be. Every dollar I set aside instead of spent was the same choice, made quietly, without applause. Warren didn't see those choices because I made them invisible. Teaching him to see them would have required me to be visible, and that was the harder thing, the thing I kept not doing. He's learning now. It's slow and it's not always comfortable, and there are still moments where I can feel the old distance between us like a draft under a door. But he drove up on a Saturday with bagels and sat at my kitchen table and read a letter I wrote him when he was 16, and when he finished, he folded it along the original creases. That matters, not because it fixed anything, but because it was real. The envelope is still in the fireproof box. The savings bond is still in there. I'm not in a rush about any of it. What I know is that the work, all of it, every early morning and long drive and quiet decision, was never wasted. It made me who I am, and who I am turned out to be someone worth knowing. It just took both of us a while to find that out. That's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything. The life you're building in the ordinary, unglamorous, unwitnessed hours, it's real. It counts. The fact that no one is watching doesn't make it smaller. If anything, it makes it more yours. Keep building. Keep showing up. The truth of who you are has a way of surfacing eventually, one way or another.